There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the hands, not the kind that comes from reading about something or watching someone else do it, or even from understanding the theory of it in an intellectual sense. This is the kind of knowledge that is deposited in the joints and the fingertips and the muscles of the forearm through years of repetition and correction and patient unhurried attention to what works and what does not work and why. Calvin Theodore Booker had this kind of knowledge. He had been accumulating it for 31 years across hundreds of vehicles and thousands of hours, and every variety of challenge that a partially dismantled, decades-old machine can present to a person who is committed to bringing it back from the edge of disappearing entirely. He knew what a seized bolt smells like when you apply heat to it correctly. He knew the exact degree of resistance in a steering column that has been properly rebuilt versus one that feels right but will give you trouble in 6 months. He knew by sound alone the difference between an engine that has been set right and an engine that has been set close enough to right that most people would not notice the gap. He had this knowledge in his hands and in his ears and in some part of him that did not have a name, the part that had been trained by 3 decades of work to read a machine the way a careful reader reads a text, not for the surface of it, but for what the surface is resting on. He had spent those 31 years doing a job that looked to people who did not understand it like mechanical work. It was mechanical work. Yes, in the sense that it involved engines and frames and body panels and interiors, and all the physical components of a vehicle that has aged beyond the point where ordinary maintenance can address it. But what the job actually was at its center was a kind of rescue. The vehicles that came to Calvin Booker's shop in those years were not vehicles that someone had decided to refurbish for profit or for curiosity. They were vehicles that had been given up on. They were sitting in barns and fields and garages and storage units under tarps and under decades of dust deteriorating in the particular patient way that metal and rubber and fabric deteriorate when no one is attending to them anymore. They were in many cases on the verge of being lost permanently, which in the world of rare vehicles means something specific and irreversible. Once the structural integrity goes, once the original components become too degraded to save, the vehicle stops being the thing it was and becomes a collection of parts at best and scrap at worst. Calvin had spent 31 years pulling vehicles back from that edge. He had spent 3 decades intervening at the last possible moment or the second to last possible moment, assessing what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt and what needed to be sourced from somewhere else in the country or sometimes somewhere else in the world. And then doing the work, the long and painstaking and deeply satisfying work of putting things back the way they were meant to be. He had worked on domestic vehicles primarily, which is to say American-made vehicles from the 1950s through the 1970s, the era that most serious collectors and restorers consider the great period of American automotive design. He had worked on Chevrolets and Fords and Chryslers and Studebakers and a dozen makes that had ceased to exist by the time he was born. He had worked on sedans and coupes and wagons and trucks on vehicles that had been prized in their day, and vehicles that had been overlooked in their day, but whose relative obscurity had over time made them rarer and therefore more significant to the people who understood what rarity in this context meant. He had a preference, if pressed, for trucks, not because they were more valuable, which they sometimes were and sometimes were not, but because there was something about the working quality of a truck, the purposefulness of the design, the way the form had been built around function rather than aspiration that appealed to the particular aesthetic sense he had developed over 30 years of looking closely at machines. A truck from this era was honest in a way that some passenger vehicles of the period were not. It was built to carry things and pull things and work in conditions that would have been unreasonable to ask of anything more delicate. And when you restored one correctly, when you brought it back to the condition it had been in when it left the factory on the day it was made, There was a clarity to the result that Calvin found genuinely moving, not sentimental. Moving in the specific way that a thing done right is moving when you understand what right meant and what it cost to get there. He had retired from the shop 3 years ago, not because the work had diminished him, but because he had decided at 55 that the moment to choose what to do next was before he had no choice left. He had a pension from the period he had spent working as a restoration specialist at a collector vehicle preservation company before opening his own shop, and he had savings from the years the shop had done well, and he had the sense to know that the time to make a deliberate choice is while you still have the strength to carry it out. The deliberate choice he had made was to spend the years he had left doing one restoration at a time, not for clients, not for money, but for himself, the way a painter who has spent a career doing commissioned work might spend their later years painting only what they want to paint. He had one project at a time. He had all the time the project required, and the project he had chosen when he retired. The project he had been working on for the 7 years between then and the morning of this story was a 1969 Ford F-100 custom cab in a color called Rangoon Red. Let us be precise about what that truck was, because precision matters in this story. The Ford F-100 was the half-ton variant of Ford's full-size pickup line during the years when that line was known as the F-Series, and the 1969 model year represented a specific moment in the truck's development. The fourth generation, which had been introduced in 1967 and which had given the F-100 a cleaner and more muscular design than its predecessors, a design that collectors have spent the decades since coming to appreciate, at a level that was not universal at the time. The custom cab designation was a trim level, not merely a name, meaning it included factory-installed features that elevated it above the base model: a padded instrument panel, additional insulation for noise reduction, a more refined interior finish, chrome accents on specific exterior components, and other details that distinguished it from the working truck a buyer who wanted only utility would have purchased. Rangoon Red was an exterior color offered by Ford during this period, a specific shade of deep, warm red, with a blue undertone that in certain lights and at certain angles showed a depth that painted steel rarely achieves. It was not the most common color offered. It was not the rarest. But the combination of that color with the custom cab trim level and the specific powertrain configuration in Calvin's truck, a 390 cubic inch V8 with a 4-speed manual transmission, had resulted in a production variant that research had established was extraordinarily rare. Fewer than 12 examples of this precise configuration were known to exist, which in the world of collector trucks is a number that changes the nature of what you are looking at. Calvin had known this when he bought the truck. He had known it the way you know something when you have spent 3 decades learning the landscape thoroughly enough to understand where the significant things are hiding. He had found the truck in the spring of 2016 in a storage facility outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, belonging to the estate of a man who had purchased it new in 1969 and had driven it until 1981, and had then parked it in the unit for reasons that no one in the family could quite reconstruct, and had never retrieved it. The truck was in the condition you would expect after 35 years in a storage unit. The paint was dull and failing, the chrome was corroded, the interior was deteriorated. The engine had not run in decades and had developed the particular internal pathology of an engine that has sat with moisture working at it for a long time. The frame was sound. The body was fundamentally intact, with no rust-through on the structural panels, which was remarkable given the storage conditions, and which was the detail that told Calvin, when he first opened the unit door and let the flashlight find the contours of what was under the tarp, that this was something worth the years it was going to take. It took 7 years. The work was not continuous in the sense of being performed every day without interruption, though there were stretches of months when it was close to that. It was continuous in the sense of always being present, always being the thing he was working toward, regardless of what else was occupying the day or the week. The engine came out and went to a specialist in Ohio who rebuilt it from the internal components, outward machining what could be machined and sourcing period-correct replacements for what could not be saved. The transmission was rebuilt by Calvin himself, one of the components he felt the most certainty about the precise work of reassembling something mechanical and checking it against the tolerances specified in the original factory manual, a document he had obtained from a collector in Oregon, and which he kept in a protective sleeve on the workbench throughout the restoration. The body received the kind of attention that takes longer than most people who have not watched it done can conceive of the surface preparation, the identification and correction of every imperfection in the steel, the application of primer in the specific sequence that the period-correct restoration protocols required, and finally, the paint itself, Rangoon Red, mixed to the exact original Ford formula by a paint supplier in Michigan who had been doing this work for 40 years. And who, when Calvin described the truck and the project, had said, "I have been waiting for someone to order this color correctly for about a decade." The interior was rebuilt, component by component. The seat recovered in the correct vinyl. The door panels replaced with materials that matched the factory specification. The headliner replaced, the carpet replaced. The chrome was taken to a plating shop that still did it the old way, which meant they still did it right. The glass was replaced where it needed replacing and buffed and sealed where it did not. The rubber seals were sourced from a supplier in Indiana who specialized in 1960s and 70s Ford trucks, and whose inventory was, according to Calvin, either a miracle or a monument to someone's obsessive dedication, both of which he respected completely. And then, in the summer of 2023, Calvin had done something he had never done on a professional restoration. He had taken a small steel plate 2 inches by 4 inches, and he had hand-engraved it with a set of letters, working with a hand engraver over 2 evenings, until the letters were exactly the depth and spacing he wanted. The plate read, "Restored by Calvin T. Booker, 2016 through 2023. He had mounted it on the dash to the right of the steering column where a driver would see it every time they sat down. Not prominently, not announced. Just present the way a signature is present at the bottom of a painting, a mark of authorship that is available to anyone who looks but does not demand anyone's attention." The truck had been submitted to the Classic Auto Invitational in October of the same year, entered by Harold Graves's auction house as a featured lot, assigned lot number 41, given an estimate of $87,000 to $110,000. Harold Graves, who had been auctioneering collector vehicles for 38 years, and who had seen in that time 3 other Rangoon Red F-100s of similar configuration pass through his facility, had looked at Calvin's truck for about 90 seconds when it was first brought in for appraisal, and had then looked at Calvin for a moment and said, "Where did you find this?" Calvin had told him. Harold had listened and then walked around the truck slowly, and then stopped at the driver's door and looked at the engraved plate on the dash, and then looked at Calvin again and said, "That is one way to sign your name to something." Calvin had said, "It is the only way I know." The morning of the auction arrived the way consequential mornings do, without fanfare, with the same light and the same cool air and the same sounds as any other morning, and Calvin was up before the light had fully settled, as he almost always was. He had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, not in the way of someone who could not sleep because they were worried, but from the particular alertness of a morning when something significant was happening, and the body knew it before the mind had finished organizing the fact. He made coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the garage where the truck had been living for the past 3 weeks since the restoration was completed and before its delivery to the auction house had been arranged. He had driven it only twice in that period, once to a detail shop for the final cleaning, and once back treating it the way you treat a thing that is finally done, with the care of not adding unnecessary miles before it went where it was going. He dressed deliberately, dark pants, a button-down shirt the color of charcoal, a jacket he had kept clean for occasions. He was not dressing for the truck. He was not dressing for the auction. He was dressing the way he had learned to dress over 58 years of a life in which he had understood that how you present yourself in the world is a part of what you are presenting, not a performance, not a costume, but a statement of the standard you hold yourself to when the standard is yours to set. He went out to the garage at 6:45. He stood for a moment looking at the truck in the garage light, the Rangoon Red paint catching and holding the light in the way that paint mixed to a specific original formula will do when it has been applied correctly with the depth of color that comes from doing it right, rather than from doing it quickly. He put his hand on the hood for a moment, not dramatically, just the hand flat on the surface, the way you touch something real to remind yourself it is real. Then he got in, started the engine, and backed out into the cool morning. The route to the auction house, the Hanover Fairgrounds exhibition hall where the Classic Auto Invitational took place each October, was 42 minutes from Calvin's house on a clear morning without traffic. He had made the drive before, though not in the truck, and he had a precise picture of the route in his mind. The highway for the first 26 miles, then the county road for the remaining 16. The auction preview was scheduled to begin at 8:15 in the morning. Calvin had left at 6:53. He had time. He drove in the early morning light the way you drive something you have rebuilt from the ground up with a continuous and specific attention that was not anxiety but was the opposite of inattention. He listened to the engine. He listened to the transmission. He listened to the particular sounds of the chassis on the highway surface, the sounds that told him whether the alignment was still exactly where it needed to be and whether the suspension was working the way it was built to work. Everything he heard was what it should be. The truck rode with the weight and the authority of a machine that had been built right, that had been taken back to its original condition and then returned to service with the kind of care that produces a result that is not just functional but correct. There is something that happens when a person drives a vehicle. They know this completely. It is not pride exactly, though pride is in it. It is closer to a particular kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when you are doing something that is entirely continuous with who you are, when the thing you are doing and the person doing it are in alignment in the specific way that a machine is in alignment, when all the tolerances are exactly right. Calvin had felt this quiet before in the last miles of other restorations, in the moment when the work was done and the vehicle moved under its own power, and the power was clean. But he had not felt it quite like this, not in this combination of the morning and the light, and the particular truck, and the particular destination, because this one was different from the professional restorations in a way he did not try to articulate even to himself. The others had been done for clients, which meant they had been done correctly and with full attention, but with the understanding that the end of the project was the moment the vehicle left his shop, the moment the work was complete and the responsibility transferred. This one was different because he had made it entirely on his terms, every decision his, the sourcing, and the sequence, and the standards. And finally, the plate on the dash with his name on it, and the vehicle was still his, as he drove it down the highway in the morning light. Still his in the sense that counted the sense in which a thing you have made is always yours, regardless of where it eventually goes, or what it eventually sells for. He was on the highway in the left lane, moving at the posted speed limit when he first saw the lights in his mirror. Officer Pete Sander had been on the force for 5 years. He was 33 years old, a man with a square face and an expression that had settled over those 5 years into a quality of permanent mild skepticism about the people he encountered in the course of his days. He had 2 prior complaints on his record. The first had been filed by a Latina woman named Yolanda Restrepo, who had described being stopped outside a grocery store and questioned about the cart she was returning a complaint that had been reviewed and resolved with a written notation. The second had been filed by a black teenager named Marcus Webb, who had been on his bicycle on a public street and had been stopped and questioned and then asked to explain himself 3 separate times in the course of a single encounter, a complaint that had resulted in another notation, and an additional training requirement that Sonder had completed without apparent modification to his approach. He was not, in the precise sense of the word, a man who had been identified as a problem by the institutions that were meant to identify problems. He had been noted. He had been notated. He had been sent to training. He had continued. He was on highway patrol this morning, a rotation he worked 3 days a week, and he had been monitoring the left lane for the past 40 minutes with the particular attention that a patrol officer in a marked car gives to vehicles that for whatever reason draw the eye. The F-100 drew the eye. It was a 60-year-old truck, and while old trucks were not uncommon on this stretch of highway, this one had the specific presence of something that had been restored. The paint too consistent, the chrome too right, the whole vehicle too composed in its appearance for a working truck that had accumulated its original miles and its original wear honestly. Sonder had noted it 3 car lengths ahead and to the right before it moved into the left lane, and had watched it for the next 1.5 miles looking for anything that justified a stop. He found erratic driving. This is the phrase he would use in his report: erratic driving lane change without adequate signal. The lane change Calvin had made moving from the right lane to the left lane to pass a slower vehicle was executed with the signal running with the check of the mirrors that a careful driver performs automatically with the smooth arc of a man who had been driving for 40 years and who was on this particular morning more alert to every aspect of his driving than he usually was, precisely because of what was in the cab with him. The signal had run for 3 seconds before the lane change was executed. 3 seconds is the minimum required by the state traffic code. Sander's report would say the signal was inadequate. The dash cam footage, which would become relevant later, showed 3 seconds. The lights came on. Calvin saw them and felt the specific heaviness of that sight, the blue and red flashing in the mirror at 6:58 in the morning on a highway where he was the only vehicle in view that looked like what he looked like, the only driver in view who looked like what he looked like. He did not panic. He did not accelerate. He moved his foot to the brake in the measured way of a man who has been here before in various forms, and who has learned through the long school of experience that what you do in this moment matters enormously, and that what matters most of all is that your behavior gives no one anything to work with except the truth, which is that you are a man who pulled over when asked, and who will answer questions when they are asked, and who is carrying nothing in this vehicle except 42 years of driving experience and a truck he built himself. He pulled to the shoulder and stopped, and he turned off the engine, and he put both hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position, visible through the windshield, and he waited. Sander walked to the driver's side window. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and his head at the specific tilt that certain officers adopt in that approach, a tilt that is not quite aggressive and not quite relaxed, but occupies the space between them, the space where authority performs itself. He looked at the truck first, not quickly. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that does not compute, the way the mind searches for the explanation that resolves the dissonance between what it expected and what it is seeing. Then he looked at Calvin. He said license and registration. Calvin provided them. He reached into the glove box with one hand, slowly the other hand remaining visible on the steering wheel, and he retrieved the registration, which was in the small leather holder where he kept it, and he handed it through the window along with his license. Sander took them and looked at them. He looked at the registration for what Calvin counted as a longer time than the information on it required, given that the information on it was clear and current and matched the vehicle. Then he looked at Calvin. He said, "This your truck?" Calvin said, "Yes, it is." Sander looked at the truck again. He looked at the body, at the paint, at the chrome, at the condition of the vehicle in a way that was not the look of someone assessing a vehicle for road safety purposes. It was the look of someone performing a calculation, and the calculation was the wrong one. the one that started from an assumption and worked backward toward evidence rather than starting from evidence and working forward toward a conclusion. Then Sonder made a sound. It was not a full laugh. It was the abbreviated version, the sound that carries the content of a laugh without bothering with the complete performance. It lasted about 2 seconds, and it was the particular sound of someone who has found something funny in a way they are not trying to fully conceal. He said, "This old junker, huh?" Calvin held his expression steady. He had not had a moment without expression. He had the expression of a man who had heard things of this nature before, and who understood that responding to the sound rather than to the question it was concealing was a choice that helped no one, least of all himself. He said, "The registration is current. My insurance is current. The vehicle is mine." Sonder said he was going to need more than just the registration. Calvin looked at him and he said carefully, "What more would you like to see?" Sonder said he wanted to see something that showed Calvin had obtained the vehicle legitimately. He used the word legitimately. He said it with a quality of emphasis that was not linguistic, was not about the meaning of the word in the dictionary, but about what the word was being deployed to imply about the person being asked to prove it. Calvin said, "The title is in the glove box." He retrieved it. The title was in Calvin's name, clear and unambiguous, filed with the state correct in every particular. He handed it through the window. Sonder looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Where did you get this truck?" Calvin said, "I bought it in 2016 from an estate sale in Knoxville, Tennessee. I have the bill of sale. It is in my home files. I did not bring it with me this morning because the registration and the title establish ownership clearly, which they do." Sonder said he was going to need Calvin to step out of the vehicle. Calvin stepped out of the vehicle. He did so carefully, the way a man of 58 steps out of a truck that sits at a certain height off the ground with one hand on the door and the attention of a person who has learned over the years to move deliberately in circumstances where the wrong motion can be misread. He stood on the shoulder of the highway with the cool morning air on his face and his hands at his sides visible open, and he looked at Sonder with the steady and controlled attention of a man who was not going to give anyone anything to use. Sonder walked around the truck. He walked around it the way Calvin had walked around it once in the storage unit in Knoxville when he first found it. But the purpose was different. Calvin had walked around it reading what it was. Sonder was walking around it looking for what he could use. He paused at the rear looking at the bed. He paused at the passenger side, looking at the door. He came back around to the driver's side, and he looked at Calvin, and then he looked at the truck again with the expression of a man who has found something fundamentally amusing, something so fundamentally inconsistent with his picture of how the world is arranged that it registers as almost comic. He laughed again, this time a little more fully. A short sound, but a full one. He said, "You restored this." He said it with the particular inflection that turns a statement of fact into a challenge, the inflection that means "I do not believe you." Calvin said, "I spent 7 years on it." Sonder said, 7 years. Calvin said, "Yes." Sonder said, "You are going to need to stay here while I check on some things." He went back to his vehicle, and Calvin stood on the shoulder of the highway with his hands at his sides, and the sun beginning to come up properly over the line of trees to the east, and the cool morning air on his face, and the truck at his back. The Rangoon Red paint catching the early light in the way that paint mixed to the original formula will catch early light with a depth and a warmth that is unmistakable to anyone who is looking at it properly. He was on his radio for 12 minutes. Calvin stood. 12 minutes on the shoulder of the highway, the trucks and cars passing at highway speed in the left lane close enough that the air moved when they went by. He stood with his hands at his sides. He did not pace. He did not take out his phone. He did not perform impatience or anxiety or any of the other things that the moment might have pushed a different person toward. He stood the way he had learned to stand when waiting with the particular composure of someone who has decided that the wait is a thing to be endured without adding to it. The composure was not easy. Let that be said clearly, because a story that omits the difficulty of the composure tells only half of what the composure costs. and therefore only half of what it means. Standing on the shoulder of that highway with your truck behind you and the registration and the title already provided, and the clock running toward 8:15 was not a situation that a man of 58 with 31 years of honest work behind him should have been standing in. Calvin knew this. He had known variations of it before in other forms on other mornings, throughout a life in which the specific weight of being questioned about the legitimacy of what you possessed had arrived more than once, and always with the same quality, the same particular demand that you demonstrate not just what was true, but what the person questioning you could accept as sufficient proof of what was true. He had never found a version of this that was not a form of exhaustion. He had found that the exhaustion could be managed, that it did not have to become the driver, that a man could stand in the weight of it without becoming what the weight was pushing him toward. But the weight was there. It was always there. And it cost something every time to hold your hands at your sides and your expression steady and your voice level while the cost was accumulating. When Sonder came back, there was another vehicle behind him. A second officer younger who had pulled up in a separate cruiser and who was now standing at the shoulder as well, a few yards back, not speaking present in the way that backup is present at a stop like this, which is to say present as a weight, as a statement about the seriousness with which the first officer has characterized the situation. Sanders said, "My partner is going to stay with you while I verify some information." Calvin looked at the second officer and then back at Sonder, and he said, "I have provided my license, my registration, and my title. What information do you still need to verify?" Sonder said he was verifying that the vehicle had not been reported stolen. Calvin said, "The vehicle has not been reported stolen. It is mine. It has been mine since 2016. You have seen the title." Sanders said the process took the time it took, and Calvin would need to remain on the shoulder until it was complete. Calvin said, "I understand." He said nothing else. The second officer stood on the shoulder. He was younger than Sonder, had a less settled expression, was looking at the truck the way a person looks at something that they are genuinely uncertain about, something that does not fit a familiar category. He did not speak to Calvin. Calvin did not speak to him. The morning continued around them, the highway noise, the occasional vehicle passing the light strengthening as the sun rose fully over the tree line. Sander came back in 8 more minutes. He walked directly to Calvin with his hands off his belt and his posture carrying the specific attitude of a man who has decided that the situation is not resolved in the direction he expected, but who is not prepared to acknowledge that openly. He said, "The vehicle is not reported stolen." Calvin said, "No, it is not." Saunders said, "I still have some questions about how a vehicle like this ends up in your possession." The phrase was the one that Calvin had been waiting for without waiting for it. The phrase that was not really a question at all, but a statement about how a man of 58 who looks like Calvin and who is standing on the shoulder of a highway with a 1969 Ford F-100 custom cab in Rangoon Red does not fit into a certain picture of the world, and how that failure to fit is itself treated as suspicious as something requiring an explanation beyond a title and a registration and a bill of sale, and 31 years of being the kind of person who knows exactly what that truck is and exactly what it took to bring it back. Calvin looked at Sonder. He said, "I am an automotive restoration specialist. I spent 31 years in this profession. I purchased this vehicle in 2016 from a legitimate estate sale, and I spent the following 7 years restoring it to original factory condition. I have the title. I have the registration. The vehicle is insured. I am on my way to an auction at the Hanover Fairgrounds where this truck is entered as a featured lot. I am happy to stand here and answer your questions, but I am not going to provide information beyond what the law requires and beyond what the documents in my possession already establish clearly." Sander looked at him. He looked at the truck. He said, "An auction." He said it the way you say something that sounds improbable. Calvin said, "The Classic Auto Invitational. It begins preview at 8:15. It is now 7:22. Sander said, "You are going to stand here until I am satisfied that this vehicle was obtained legally." Calvin said, "I understand." And then he stood. He stood on the shoulder of the highway with his hands at his sides, and he looked without drama at nothing in particular in the middle distance, and he let himself inhabit the 7 years. Not to make time pass more quickly. Not as an escape from the moment. But because the 7 years were the most honest response he had to the moment, the most complete answer to the question that Saunders' attitude was really asking. The 7 years were in the engine which he had rebuilt from the inside out, which ran with the authority of something that had been done right the first time, and undone and redone until done right the second time. The 7 years were in the body which he had stripped to bare metal, and rebuilt the surface in the patient sequence that period-correct restoration required. The 7 years were in the transmission, which he had taken apart himself on a workbench in his garage at 11 o'clock at night, because the tolerances were not exactly where the factory manual said they needed to be, and he was not going to send this truck back into the world with the transmission running at anything less than exactly where it needed to be. The 7 years were in the paint, the Rangoon Red, that had been mixed to the exact original Ford formula by a man in Michigan who had understood what Calvin was doing and had wanted to get it right. The 7 years were in the interior, in the recovered seats and the replaced headliner and the sourced rubber seals and the rebuilt chrome and the replaced glass and the 100 other components that had been found or made or machined or recovered and then installed with the attention that the factory itself had given to this truck in 1969 when the factory cared about what it was making. And the 7 years were in the plate on the dash, 2 inches by 4 inches, hand-engraved over 2 evenings, mounted to the right of the steering column where a driver would see it every time they sat down. Restored by Calvin T. Booker, 2016 through 2023. Not prominent, not demanding. Just present the way truth is present when it is built into a thing rather than declared about a thing. Calvin stood on the shoulder of the highway, and the morning moved, and Saunders stood near his vehicle, and the second officer stood a few yards back, and the auction preview was scheduled for 8:15 at the Hanover Fairgrounds, and the clock was not stopping, and the featured lot designation required the truck to be present for preview, and the reserve price was contingent on the featured lot designation, and none of this was anything Calvin said aloud, because there was no one on this shoulder of this highway who needed to hear it from him. At 7:31, a black sedan pulled to the shoulder behind Saunders' cruiser. Saunders watched it in his mirror. He put his hand near his belt. The sedan came to a complete stop, and the engine went off, and the driver's side door opened, and a man got out who was 64 years old, 6'1" in a dark suit and a white shirt and a tie the color of slate. He had white hair, a good deal of it, and a posture that was not military, but that belonged to a man who had spent 4 decades standing in rooms where people were paying close attention to what he said. He looked at the scene on the shoulder, the truck, Calvin Sander, the second officer, and he looked at all of it with the specific expression of a man who has been doing something for 38 years and who can read a room, or in this case a roadside, in the time it takes to draw a breath. This was Harold Graves. Harold was the senior auctioneer and principal of Graves Classical Vehicle Auctions, which he had founded in 1988, and which had in the 38 years since become one of the 4 or 5 collector vehicle auction houses in the country, that serious collectors and serious restoration specialists went to when they wanted a transaction conducted by people who actually understood what they were transacting. Harold had handled vehicles worth in the low thousands, and vehicles worth more than $1 million. And what he had learned over those 38 years was that the value of a vehicle, the real value, was almost never the number that the first impression of a non-expert produced. The real value was in the specific details, the provenance, the configuration, the rarity of the particular combination of features that a given vehicle represented the condition of the original components versus the quality of the replacement ones in the story, which in the collector vehicle world is not a sales tool, but a document, a verifiable record of where a vehicle has been and what has been done to it and by whom. Harold had tracked Calvin's location via the auction house's security protocol for featured lots, which involved, with the seller's consent, and in this case with Calvin's express written consent, the monitoring of the seller's mobile device during the transport window. Featured lots were insured by the auction house during transport, which meant the auction house had an interest in their location, and Harold had been at his own desk that morning since 6:30 reviewing the morning's final preparations. When the monitoring system had shown Calvin's device stopped on the highway, not at the fairgrounds, not moving, not resolving in any direction for 22 minutes. He had called Calvin's phone at 7:29. Calvin had answered and said quietly that he was pulled over and that he was fine, and that there might be a delay. Harold had said he was on his way. Calvin had said that was not necessary. Harold had said, "Lot 41 is my responsibility from the moment the transport window opens. I will be there in 6 minutes." He had been there in 5. He walked to Sonder first. He did not walk to Calvin first. He walked to the officer who appeared to be in charge of the stop, which was the correct professional approach, and he held out his hand and introduced himself, his name and his organization in the tone of a man who introduces himself as information rather than as performance. He said he was the auctioneer responsible for Lot 41 in today's Classic Auto Invitational at the Hanover Fairgrounds, and that the vehicle currently pulled over on this shoulder of the highway was Lot 41, which was expected at the fairgrounds for an 8:15 preview. Sander looked at him. "Sanders said you track this guy here." Harold said we track all featured lots during the transport window with the seller's documented consent as a condition of our transport insurance coverage. He said it without inflection as a matter of fact, which was what it was. Then Harold reached into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket. He did this without hurrying. He was a man who did not hurry when he was making a point, because hurrying conceded to the pace of someone else's understanding, and Harold had been setting the pace of understanding in rooms for 38 years, and was not going to stop now on the shoulder of a highway. He drew out a folded document. He unfolded it with the same unhurried deliberateness. It was the auction catalog open to the page for Lot 41. The page had a photograph of the truck, a professional photograph taken at the auction house when the vehicle had been submitted for appraisal in the specific light that Harold's photographer used for featured lots. A light that did what the Rangoon Red paint did with correct light. It showed the depth of it, the specific quality of a color that had been mixed to the original formula and applied by someone who knew what the original formula was meant to look like when it was right. The page had the lot number 41 in bold. It had the estimate $87,000 to $110,000. It had the full vehicle description. Harold held the catalog page toward Sander. He said, "This is what you are looking at." Sander looked at the catalog page. His expression changed. Not all at once. In the sequence in which a face changes when the information it is receiving does not match the structure it built for the morning, the structure of what it expected to find when it ran the plates and ran the stop and waited for the confirmation it expected. The face does not change cleanly. It changes in pieces, and each piece arrives slightly after the information that prompted it, the way weather arrives after the pressure system that caused it. Calvin watched. He watched without expression, which is to say he watched with the expression of a man who has been waiting. Not for this moment exactly. He had not been waiting in these past 20 minutes on the shoulder of this highway for Harold Graves to arrive and produce a catalog. He had been waiting for a much longer time in a much more general sense, the way that a person who has spent 31 years doing something real and true and difficult waits without urgency and without complaint for the moment when what they have made speaks for itself in a room where the right people are listening. He had not needed to arrange this moment. He had not needed to engineer it or manufacture it or ask for it. He had only needed to build the truck, and the truck had done the rest. Harold turned to the vehicle. He walked to it the way he always walked to a vehicle he knew, which was with the specific attention of someone reading a document they have read before and are checking for accuracy. He noted the body condition running his eye along the panel lines. He noted the paint tilting his head slightly the way you do when you are checking for the depth of a color in natural light. He noted the chrome, which was correct. He noted the proportions of the truck, which were the proportions of the custom cab variant and not the base model, and which were to a trained eye identifiable from several yards away. He came to the driver's door. He opened it gently with the practiced care of a man who handles valuable vehicles as a matter of professional habit. He looked at the interior. He looked at the seat, the dash, the headliner, the door panel. He looked at the specifics of the interior finish that distinguish a custom cab from a base model at the details level, not the obvious level. And then he looked at the dash and he found what he was looking for. He pointed to the engraved plate, 2 inches by 4 inches mounted to the right of the steering column. He read it aloud. He read it in the clear, carrying voice of a man who has spent 38 years projecting his voice to the back of a room. Restored by Calvin T. Booker, 2016 through 2023. He looked at Sander. Sander looked at the plate. He stepped forward. He stepped to the door of the truck, the door that Harold was holding open, and he leaned in and he read the plate himself. His lips moved slightly. He read it once, and then he read it again. He stood up. He did not speak immediately. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which on the shoulder of a highway at 7:33 in the morning with an auction preview scheduled for 8:15 is a silence of a particular quality. The quality of something that has shifted without yet having been acknowledged. Harold said to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, "This truck has an estimated auction value of $87,000 to $110,000. The configuration, the Rangoon Red custom cab with the 390 V8 and 4-speed manual, is one of fewer than 12 known examples. The restoration is period correct and has been assessed by our appraisal team as exceptional quality. This is not a working truck. This is a museum-grade restoration performed by a professional with 31 years of experience in this specific field." He paused. Then he said, "And the man who restored it is standing on your shoulder." Sander looked at Calvin. He looked at the truck. He looked at the catalog page, which he was still holding. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man who was sorry. It was the expression of a man who had been confronted with a reality that did not fit the picture, and who had not yet decided what to do with the gap. It was a face in the process of recalculating, which is not the same as a face in the process of understanding, but it was what was there. Calvin walked to the truck. He walked to the driver's door, which Harold was still holding open, and he reached in, and he took his keys from where Sander had asked him to leave them on the seat. He took them deliberately the way you take something that belongs to you without performance, without announcement, with the specific certainty of a man who is recovering something that was never legitimately withheld in the first place. He held the keys in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at Harold. He said, "I believe we have a preview to get to." Harold smiled. It was the specific smile of someone who has seen many things in 38 years, and who was in this moment seeing something that was not common. He said, "We do." He stepped back from the door. He gestured. Calvin got in. He adjusted himself in the seat the way he always did. The particular adjustment of a man who has been in this seat enough times to know exactly where everything is and to confirm each time that everything is where it belongs. He started the engine. The 390 V8 turned over with the authority of something rebuilt correctly, the idle settling in with the specific evenness of an engine that is running at the tolerances the factory specified. The sound of it filled the morning air on the shoulder of the highway. Not loud, not showy, just precise. The way a properly built engine sounds, the sound of things working together at the levels they were designed to work at. He pulled back onto the highway. The engine settled into the rhythm of a vehicle moving at speed, the sound of it even and clean and correct in every particular that 31 years of professional attention had taught him to listen for. Sanders stood on the shoulder and watched the Rangoon Red F-100 custom cab merge into traffic and accelerate to highway speed and move away, the paint catching the morning sun, and the engine doing what rebuilt engines do when the work has been done right. And he stood there with the auction catalog page still in his hand, and the second officer a few yards behind him, and the silence of a highway morning around everything. Harold walked back to his sedan. He paused for a moment before getting in, and he looked at Sonder, and he said without heat, without anger, with the measured directness of a man who has spent 38 years saying exactly what he means. That man spent 31 years learning to do something that almost no one can do. He spent 7 of those years doing it to a single vehicle, and he was on his way to an auction where what he built was going to sell for close to $100,000. Whatever question you had about that truck or about him this morning, Mr. Booker answered it. He answered it 7 years ago. Then Harold got in his car and drove to the Hanover Fairgrounds. Calvin arrived at the Hanover Fairgrounds at 7:51 in the morning. The preview began at 8:15. He had 24 minutes. He pulled the truck into the receiving area where the exhibition hall's staff were managing the flow of vehicles, and the young man who came out to meet him, a staff member who had been told to watch for Lot 41, stopped when he saw the truck and said, "That is it." Not a question. A recognition. Calvin said yes. The young man walked around the truck once before helping direct Calvin to the display position that had been reserved for Lot 41 in the main hall. The position that featured lots received, which was near the center of the hall, where the traffic through the space would bring the most eyes to it. The truck was in position by 8:07. The preview opened at 8:15, and the people who came in during the preview hour were the people who always come to preview at an auction like this: dealers, collectors, enthusiasts who know enough to be here and enough to know what they are looking for. They came to Lot 41 in numbers that the auction house staff noticed. They came in groups, and they stood around the truck, and they did what people who know what they are looking at do. They looked carefully at the specific things that tell a person who knows the field what the field actually contains. They looked at the paint, and they asked each other about the color, and several of them knew it or knew of it. They looked at the chrome, and they looked at the body lines, and they looked at the interior. And several of them found the engraved plate on the dash and read it, and then looked for Calvin, who was standing near the truck, and introduced themselves and asked him questions that were the real questions. The questions that a person asks when they are genuinely interested in how something came to be. Harold Graves conducted the auction beginning at 10 o'clock. Lot 41 was called at 10:47. Harold described it in the way he described everything, with precision and without embellishment, because precision is its own form of persuasion when what you are describing is genuinely remarkable. He described the configuration, the year, the make, the model, the trim level, the color, the rarity, the provenance, the restoration history. He read into the microphone the inscription on the engraved plate on the dash. He said the truck was restored by one man over 7 years to period-correct original factory specification by an automotive restoration specialist with 31 years of professional experience. The work has been assessed by our appraisal team as exceptional. The estimate is $87,000 to $110,000. We will open bidding at $70,000. The bidding opened at $70,000 and moved quickly the way bidding moves on something that multiple interested parties have already decided they want before they walked into the room. It passed $87,000, which was the bottom of the estimate range, in less than 4 minutes. It passed $100,000, which was the upper range of the estimate, at the 6-minute mark. It continued. Harold moved through the bids with the ease of someone in complete command of the room, reading the bidders, managing the pace, allowing the bids time to accumulate without allowing the energy to dissipate. The hammer came down at $119,000. The room made the specific sound that auction rooms make when a result has exceeded the estimate by a distance that surprises even the people who thought they knew what it was worth. Harold said into the microphone with the composure that 38 years of doing this produces: sold. Lot 41. $119,000. Calvin was standing at the side of the hall. He heard the hammer and he heard the number, and he stood with his hands at his sides, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was not exhilaration. It was something quieter and more solid than either of those things, the expression of a man who built something correctly and who has watched the world confirm what correct means in the terms the world has available to it. He had not needed the confirmation. He had known what the truck was since the day he found it in the storage unit in Knoxville, since the day he put the flashlight through the door and saw the frame and the body and understood what was still possible. He had known it through 7 years of the work, and through every evening on the workbench, and through every part sourced and every tolerance checked, and every evening over the hand engraver working the letters into the plate. He had known it. The auction had not told him anything he did not already know. But the auction had said it in a language that the room could hear, and that had its own particular value. The complaint Calvin filed against Officer Pete Sander was processed through the department's review board 8 weeks after the stop. The dash cam footage was reviewed. The footage showed the lane change, the signal, the 3-second duration that met the statutory requirement. The footage showed the stop and the walk, and the laugh, which was audible, and the multiple requests for documentation beyond what the law required, and what the established stop documentation showed was already provided. The footage showed the 22 minutes Calvin stood on the shoulder and the arrival of backup without documented justification for the escalation and the questions about how the vehicle had been obtained. The review board found the complaint substantiated in full. Sander received a formal written reprimand and a 60-day suspension, the most significant formal consequence he had received in 5 years on the force. The union filed a grievance. The grievance was reviewed and partially sustained, which reduced the suspension to 45 days. The reprimand stood. What Calvin said when a reporter from the regional newspaper asked him how he had felt, standing on that shoulder of the highway, while Sander questioned whether he legitimately owned what he had spent 7 years building, was this. He said, "I knew what the truck was. I knew what I had put into it. I knew what it was worth, and I knew why it was worth it. And I knew every single component of it, because I had been in every single component of it with my hands. What I felt standing there had nothing to do with uncertainty about any of that. I felt what I have felt before, and what I think a lot of people who look like me feel before, which is the specific weight of being in a place where the truth is already clear to you, and where you have to wait for the world to catch up to what you already know. The weight of that is not something you get used to, but you learn to stand in it." He paused for a moment. Then he said, "The truck will be fine, by the way. The buyer is a collector in North Carolina. He called me last week. He wanted to know what I used for the paint. I told him. He is going to take care of it right." That is the kind of man Calvin Theodore Booker is. 58 years old, 31 years of knowing what he is doing. 7 years of one project done completely right, and at the end of everything. Not the price, or the reprimand, or the moment. When the officer had to lean in and read the plate with his own eyes. The thing he wanted you to know was that the truck was going to be taken care of. If this story meant something to you, subscribe our channel. We tell stories about people who spent 31 years building something real and did not need anyone's permission to own what they built.